The silent warning hidden in solitude: there is a kind of silence that heals. And there is another that watches. Not all solitude is weakness. Not all loneliness is emptiness. Some people walk alone because they are called inward. Others walk alone because the world could not follow them. But there is a third type of solitary being, one that ancient traditions, mystics, and depth psychology have all warned us about. This is the solitary one who has no friends. Not by destiny, not by calling, but by inner fracture. In the psychological framework of Carl Jung, the human psyche is not a smooth surface. It is a deep terrain of shadows, archetypes, suppressed instincts, and unintegrated forces. When a person lives cut off from meaningful relationships for too long, something begins to form in the unconscious, not peace, but pressure. And pressure always seeks release. Jung once observed that what is not made conscious does not disappear. It returns as fate. This is where the danger begins. Solitude versus isolation. A crucial distinction. Jung never condemned solitude itself. On the contrary, he believed that true individuation, a process of becoming one's authentic self, often requires periods of withdrawal from the collective. But isolation is not solitude. Solitude is chosen. Isolation is imposed, often by the ego, the shadow, or unresolved trauma. The solitary individual who has no friends and rejects all bonds is often not free. They are guarded, armored, psychically barricaded. Behind that wall lives a shadow that has not been seen. The shadow grows in silence. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is the part of ourselves we deny, repress, or fear. It contains instincts, emotions, desires, rage, envy, and power that the conscious personality cannot accept. In healthy individuals, relationships act as mirrors. Friends, conflicts, love, and rejection all force the shadow into awareness. But when a person lives without friends, without reflection, without friction, the shadow grows unchecked. Jung warned that when the shadow is not integrated, it becomes autonomous. It begins to think, react, and act independently of conscious values. This is why some of the most destructive personalities in history were profoundly isolated long before they were dangerous. Not because solitude created evil, but because no one was there to challenge the shadow. Why the friendless are not always harmless. There is a modern myth that the quiet, friendless individual is automatically harmless, gentle, or enlightened. Jung would disagree. The psyche requires relationship to remain balanced. Without it, inner fantasies replace reality. Resentiments ferment, imaginary narratives harden into belief systems. The isolated mind becomes its own echo chamber. And here is the uncomfortable truth Jung hinted at. A person without friends has no external correction. Without correction, the ego can inflate. Without reflection, delusion can masquerade as truth. The archetype of the outcast deep within the collective unconscious exists. The outcast archetype, the one rejected by the tribe. This archetype is ancient. In mythology, the outcast becomes either the wise hermit or the vengeful destroyer. The difference is not intelligence. The difference is integration. The hermit has confronted his shadow. The destroyer has fused with it. When the solitary person identifies only with rejection, bitterness, or superiority, the psyche begins to split. Jung called this an ensiedromiata, process by which an extreme turns into its opposite. Extreme withdrawal eventually turns into extreme hostility. The psychological alchemy gone wrong. Jung used alchemy as a metaphor for psychological transformation. The goal was gold, not material wealth, but inner wholeness. Solitude can be the furnace where transformation occurs, but isolation without consciousness becomes a cauldron of poison. Instead of transmuting pain into wisdom, the isolated individual may transmute pain into ideology, obsession, or quiet hatred. This is why Jung warned against mistaking withdrawal for enlightenment. Not everyone who walks alone is awakened. Some are simply wounded, without witnesses. When the ego replaces God, one of Jung's most chilling insights was that when spiritual meaning disappears, the ego rushes in to take its place. The isolated person often lacks community, ritual, shared myth, or transcendent connection. In that vacuum, the ego inflates to divine proportions. The person becomes their own judge, their own prophet, their own moral authority. This is not strength. This is psychic imbalance. Jung observed this pattern clearly in individuals who cut themselves off from others, while cultivating a sense of secret superiority. They do not need friends because they believe they see more clearly than everyone else. But what they see is often the shadow projected outward. Projection. The hidden weapon of the isolated psyche. Projection is one of Jung's central concepts. What we cannot accept within ourselves, we unconsciously assign to others. The friendless solitary often sees Corruption everywhere, stupidity in the masses, evil intentions in strangers. But Jung would ask a devastating question. What part of you is being projected? Without relationships, projection becomes absolute. There is no one close enough to contradict the fantasy. This is how paranoia is born, not as madness, but as unchecked imagination. The spiritual danger no one talks about. Spiritually, prolonged isolation can open doors, but not all doors lead upward. Ancient mystical traditions warn that those who enter solitude without humility encounter not God, but their demons. Jung echoed this psychologically. When a person descends into the unconscious without preparation, guidance, or grounding, the archetypes overwhelm the ego. The solitary individual may believe they are chosen, awakened, or enlightened when in reality, they are possessed by unconscious forces. This is why Jung insisted that relationship is a safeguard of sanity. A warning, not a condemnation. This is not a condemnation of introverts, not a rejection of mystics, not an attack on those who walk alone by calling. Jung's warning was more subtle and more merciful. He warned us to be cautious of unexamined solitude, of loneliness that becomes identity, of isolation that becomes ideology, of silence that hides unhealed wounds. The solitary without friends is not dangerous because they are alone, but because no one knows what is growing inside. The invitation hidden in the warning. Jung believed that every psychological danger is also an invitation. The solitary soul is standing at a crossroads. Integrate the shadow. Or become italiano. Use solitude for individuation, or for withdrawal from life. Return to humanity, transformed, or return embittered and broken. The path is narrow, the descent is deep, and the cost of refusal when solitude turns toxic. There is a moment almost imperceptible when solitude stops being a sanctuary and begins to rot from within. Carl Jung understood this moment not as a moral failure, but as a psychological threshold. Beyond it, the psyche no longer uses solitude for reflection. It uses it for defense. The soul closes its gates. The warning signs are subtle at first. The solitary person begins to romanticize isolation not as a phase, but as an identity. People are stupid. I don't need anyone. I see through the illusion of society. What sounds like wisdom often masks fear, disappointment, or unresolved grief. Jung insisted that when solitude becomes absolute, it ceases to be a tool of individuation and becomes a mechanism of avoidance. And avoidance always has a cost. The behavioral signs Jung would watch for. Jung did not diagnose danger by appearance. He listened for patterns, recurring psychic movements that revealed imbalance. Among the solitary without friends, he would quietly note rigid worldviews. When ideas harden into dogma, the psyche has stopped evolving. The isolated mind resists contradiction because contradiction feels like annihilation. Moral inflation. The solitary individual begins to divide the world into enlightened versus ignorant, pure versus corrupt. This is the ego wearing the mask of righteousness. Chronic projection. Everyone else is manipulative, shallow, or evil. Rarely does the solitary one ask what inner conflict is being displaced onto the world. Emotional detachment disguised as peace. Jung warned that numbness often pretends to be serenity. True peace still feels. It does not freeze. Secret grandiosity. Even when outwardly modest, the isolated psyche may carry a hidden belief. I am different. I am chosen. I see what others cannot. These are not sins. They are symptoms. And symptoms are messages. The possession by an archetype. One of Jung's most unsettling ideas was that archetypes can possess the ego. When a person lacks grounding relationships, the unconscious fills the void. The solitary individual may unknowingly identify with powerful archetypes. The prophet, the judge, the avenger, the hermit god. At first, this feels empowering, meaning rushes in. Certainty replaces doubt. But this is not integration, it is inflation. Jung warned that when the ego believes it is the archetype rather than a servant of it, psychological balance collapses. The person is no longer living their life. They are acting out a myth unconsciously. This is how inner drama becomes outer conflict. Why some solitary souls become dangerous, this must be said, carefully and compassionately. Not all solitary people are dangerous, but some dangerous people were once profoundly solitary. Jung noted that prolonged isolation, combined with unintegrated shadow material, creates a volatile psychic mixture. Resentment seeks justification. Pain seeks meaning. And the mind, desperate for coherence, may construct an enemy. When the solitary individual feels unseen by the world, the temptation arises to force the world to see. Sometimes through ideology, sometimes through domination, sometimes through destruction. This is not madness in the cinematic sense. It is a slow psychological drift, one that society often ignores until it is too late. The spiritual bypass of isolation. Jung was deeply critical of what we now call spiritual bypassing using spiritual language to avoid psychological work. The isolated person may say, "I don't need people, I need truth. I've transcended human attachments. Loneliness is an illusion." But Jung would ask, have you transcended humanity or fled from it? True spiritual maturity does not eliminate relationship. It transforms it. If spirituality leads to contempt for others, something has gone wrong. The forgotten role of community in individuation. Contrary to popular belief, Jung never taught that individuation happens in isolation forever. Yes, the journey begins inward, but it must return outward. Individuation means becoming oneself, not becoming alone. Jung believed the fully individuated person re-enters the world with humility, humor, and compassion. They can stand apart without standing above. The solitary who never returns is not individual. They are withdrawing from life. And life, Jung warned, always demands participation. The redemptive path for the solitary soul here is where Jung's work becomes deeply hopeful. No psyche is beyond repair. Even the most withdrawn soul carries a seed of return. The healing does not begin with forcing friendships or social performance. It begins with truthful Jung would recommend shadow dialogue writing, dream analysis, or inner dialogue with rejected parts of the self. The goal is not purity but honesty. Symbolic expression, art, music, myth, and ritual allow unconscious material to surface safely. One authentic relationship. Not many. Not crowds. Just one real human mirror who can reflect without judgment. Humility before the unconscious, recognizing that insight does not equal superiority. Wisdom bows before mystery. Service without self-importance, acts of quiet contribution re-anchor. The ego in humanity, this is not easy work, but it is sacred work. The sacred return to humanity. Jung believed the ultimate test of psychological and spiritual growth was relationship. Can you listen without defending? Can you disagree without contempt? Can you be seen without hiding behind an identity? The solitary who integrates the shadow does not lose depth, they gain warmth. They no longer need to be right. They no longer need to be separate. They no longer need to be feared. They become whole. A final warning and a final blessing: beware of the solitary ones who have no friends, not because they are evil, but because they are unmarried. What grows unseen grows distorted. But also remember this: within the solitary soul lies immense potential. The same depth that can breed darkness can also birth wisdom. The same silence that hides resentment can also incubate revelation. Jung never asked us to fear the solitaries. He asked us to understand them and, when possible, to help them return. Because the soul was not made to be alone forever. It was made to descend, to integrate, and then to come back bearing light.